Okay, good day and good morning, everyone. It is indeed with a great pleasure that I'm able to see so many people joining here today. When I created this session or this webinar, I had no idea just how many people would actually join in the end. And in matter of fact, today we have over, I think, 500 people almost signed up on the LinkedIn event itself. So that is absolutely fantastic. And of course, today's topic is pretty straightforward. It is about ServiceNow Discovery. And it's a very, very simple question, which is it worth the money? And before I jump into the actual topic itself, I'm just going to set the stage a little bit because I have made an observation. So first of all, there is a lot of questions around ServiceNow ITOM when it comes to the value. Like I went out to Google, on Reddit and so forth, and I've done this many, many times. And when you start searching for information about especially ROI, the value, does it pay off or not, you find so many people asking questions about how to quantify it, what are some tips, does it really pay off in the end, and so forth and so on. Yet there is very little material to be found specifically on this topic. Of course, ServiceNow has their calculators. You also have some reports from Forrester and so forth. But really, to find this kind of tangible material is quite difficult. And that is kind of the basis why I selected to create this webinar here today. And we are able to see this through the fact that I mentioned that almost over 500 people when I checked today have signed up on the LinkedIn event. And that is absolutely mind-blowing. I had 1,500 visitors to the LinkedIn event. So that also tells me that there is a huge interest in this. And finally, I've had over 30 pre-submitted questions. So clearly, there is a lot to be discussed and unpacked here today. And I'm going to do my best to do so. And you might now be wondering, who am I who are speaking? Well, my name is Alexander Ljungström. And I am the founder of Einar Partners, which is a firm that is only focusing on one thing and one thing only, which is ServiceNow ITOM and the strategy around that, essentially. And you might sometimes hear the phrase AiOps being used in place of ITOM. And throughout my career, I have now worked approximately 8 years with the ServiceNow ITOM product. I have 12 years, if not a bit more, of experience in ITOM as a general topic. And as a matter of fact, I used to work directly at ServiceNow in their ITOM team quite a few years ago. And I am very, very passionate about ITOM and kind of how it truly can be used within an organization and how it can provide value. So that is the things that I am essentially pondering every day about. Now, I was supposed to have a moderator with me here today. That is unfortunately not possible, which means that I am running this webinar completely by myself today. So I will have to try and do my best in order to multitask and really kind of do my best to keep track of the chat and try to moderate this as I go. I just want to set a few expectations, some good information to be aware of before we get started. For example, I just received a question whether the webinar will be recorded or not. And absolutely it will be recorded. You will be able to find it on the Einar Partners YouTube channel. And more importantly, you will also get the recording sent to you. Also, if you have any questions during the webinar, there should be a chat and there should be a Q&A box where you can write to me. Obviously, it might be difficult for me to reply to each and every question live during the webinar, but because this is such an interesting topic, I will personally get back to you if I don't have time to do so. However, I am not a sales representative. So this is a little bit sensitive when we speak about return on investment, measuring ROI, financial data, values, etc. I just want to be very clear that I come from a technical background. I am very, very enthusiastic and passionate about the value and ROI, but I am not a sales representative from ServiceNow. So obviously you should take today's webinar as the opinions are my own and based on the observations that I have done. And also to set expectations, today's webinar is not about licensing or pricing. As always, this information is best fetched directly through your ServiceNow sales representative. So I will not touch upon licensing or pricing of the product or go down that rabbit hole, because then we would be sitting here all day. And finally, this is not me, trying to convince you today that Discovery is the absolute kick-ass product that you have to invest to. So you will not be sitting through a sales session here today, but really what we'll be doing is looking at data based on real experience that I personally have gathered together with me and my team and in my previous jobs. So just to set this in perspective, I think I have guided and led right now over 30 Discovery rollouts on a global scale. Obviously I have been able to see patterns, I have been able to see commonalities, and that is what I want to share with you here today. And for those of you who are in a bit of a time crunch, I usually don't like always when there are questions and then you have to wait all until the end to get the answer to the question. So I'm just going to drop that off right now. Is ServiceNow Discovery worth the money? Yeah, probably, but there are exceptions to it, and that is what I want to discuss and touch upon today, among other things. And speaking of what I will touch upon then today, I will try to structure it in the following way then. So we have right now approximately 50 minutes left, and I will start speaking about the value, because it's really important for me that in order to understand the ROI and how you kind of measure cost reductions, the financial impacts, etc., you also need to fundamentally understand what value are you looking for when you start with ServiceNow Discovery. So I will speak about that, different type of IT organizations, and I will see you a value matrix, or I will show you a value matrix that we have developed, and I think it's a really easy one that you can use yourself. But then, of course, more importantly, is the measurements. So measuring ROI, some of the impact factors when we're speaking about ROI, and also then when it comes to implementation. So when the project is actually kicking off, how do we ensure that we don't cannibalize on our future ROI through having a disastrous project, for example? And then, of course, benchmarks. As I mentioned, we have done many Discovery rollouts, and based on these rollouts, we want to share with you here, actually, first time ever, some of these Discovery benchmarks. Yet again, it's not about the cost, it's not about the pricing benchmarks, but it's more around how long time does it take to implement Discovery, what are some common challenges, timelines, etc. And hopefully this can help you or your clients plan their discovery and coordinate it a little bit better. And as I mentioned, feel free to ask any questions as we go here. So there should be a chat, and the same if you hear that maybe my sound quality drops or something like that, just let me know, because I'm kind of having a monologue with myself right now. Okay, excellent. Let's get down to it then. So as I mentioned, the value is super important. And when we look at value, it's very easy to get caught up in this kind of salesy hype bubble of, oh, it's the best ever, it provides, great values, etc., and, big inflated numbers. And I want to take that down a notch and really start looking at how we can estimating value in a realistic way. And before we start estimating the value, we first need to understand where in the maturity scale our IT organization is. So here is a scale that I have developed, and it starts then from old school, let's say, IT organizations. So the old school IT organizations, they tend to have their own data centers. A majority is internal IT. They tend to have quite a lot of legacy. They might not even have a CMDB. Perhaps it is scattered around in Excel sheets, could be spread out in different tools. Maybe you have network equipment in SolarWind, and You have SCCM for your clients and servers and whatever. But then fundamentally, what we're looking at tends to be a low process maturity and rather fragmented IT operations. And you might think, are people still there today? And yes, believe me, I am often meeting organizations who are still kind of, I'm calling it old school, but they are still on this side of the maturity scale. And then we have what I call the hybrid, let's say, IT organization when it comes to maturity. So this is where you start seeing a mixture of internal IT with some outsourced IT. There might be some cloud activities going on. Perhaps you're using Azure, perhaps you're using AWS, etc. They tend to also already use ITIL and ITSM in one capacity or another. So the usual incident, change, etc. But nonetheless, the struggles then are often focused on still legacy systems, still a lot of old tools in the IT landscape. There might be a large sprawl when it comes to cloud resources, outsourced resources, etc. And then finally, governance. And when we speak about automation, it tends to also be rather low. Now, cloud native IT organizations then, they tend to be heavily outsourced. And when I say outsource, it's not necessarily that I mean that they have everything with IBM or something like that, but pretty much that their own internal IT and on-prem infrastructure, etc., tends to be fairly low. And these type of organizations also have often, in one capacity or another, a CMDB in place then. And I often also see here DevOps initiatives and active cloud projects. And these organizations tend to run a sort of hybrid way of ITIL. So there are some parts of the organization which is using ITIL practices. There are other parts who are using DevOps practices. And then there are maybe some small isolated, let's say, islands within the IT organization that are very mature and they are looking at machine learning, site reliability engineering, that type of thing. And then finally, we have what I call the cutting edge IT organization. So this is an IT organization who truly embraces data. They live and breathe data, and they have DevOps, CloudOps, all of these things are in full swing and in full operations. They also tend to be very skeptical about ITIL in my experience, because they think that is a thing of the past and that is not a thing of the future, which is a different topic to discuss. And I also often see this monolithic infrastructure is gone, but rather they're using a lot of different infrastructure as code, everything as a service, that type of thing. And interestingly enough, I often see that the FTE count is fairly low for these type of IT organizations. So they are able to do a lot with few amount of people. And in general, the IT organizations tend to be more flat. So why am I mentioning these things? It's not necessarily black or white, that you are one or the other. If you are a global company, it is very possible that you have a mixture of this depending on where you look. But it is important to ask yourself this question and assess where you are. Because historically seen, up until approximately 2 years ago, then I would say that when you hit this kind of cutting edge side of the IT organization here, that is kind of where ServiceNow Discovery were not able to keep up. And what I mean with that is 2-3 years ago, ServiceNow Discovery would not be able to do all the cool DevOps thing, to integrate with Kubernetes, Docker, microservices, etc., etc. But that has changed. And today, I think it's fair to say that ServiceNow Discovery as a product and platform is able to cover the entire range of spectrum here. So this is good to be aware of. And it's really good, as I mentioned before, to ask yourself this question: where is your IT organization here on this scale? And as I said, it could be regional differences and so forth, depending on the size. Because this will determine what type of values you can expect from Discovery, all right? And that is what I want to start off with speaking about now. So this is a value matrix for ServiceNow Discovery. You will not be able to find this somewhere else. And I am a little bit unorthodox when it comes to how I look at things in life, and especially, let's say, IT and ServiceNow ITOM. So this might not fully resonate with everyone, and I fully respect that. But this is something that I like to employ and use in my daily work, because I like to simplify things. And I like to take something very, very complex like discovery and looking at the values and simplify them. So we have two axes here. The first one is measurable ROI. So how tangible can we actually measure things when it comes to implementing discovery? So if we do a before and after snapshot, how tangible is the ROI? How easy is it to actually measure? And then on the other side, on the left side, we have governance. And I'm going to come to that in a bit. So when something is easy to measure in ROI, it means that it typically pays off in numbers. So this is where you have direct cost reductions, all right? So it's very easy to measure, and there are methodologies of doing so. On the other hand, in the top here is where we see things pays off in culture. And this for me is hugely interesting, because we see more and more, let's say, in that area today. The more we modernize, the less tangible the ROI actually becomes, because the differences from a technological perspective is not always huge. There are small incremental steps, but the differences in cultural aspects for the IT organizations can be enormous. And this is what I like to call indirect cost reductions. So it has a secondary effect. And now you might be wondering, all right, but how can we place things here? Well, I'm going to show you an example. And this is very, very easy to keep in mind. So when we speak about things which are low in measurable ROI, so things are not always very tangible, they tend to be the first level, data ownership. So if you today don't have good data ownership, discovery tends to help there a lot. So essentially, you know who owns what within the IT organization or within the cloud or whatever it is. And as you can see here, the governance, that is what you least should expect from a governance level, ownership. But at the same time, just because you get ownership, I mean, you cannot measure that in direct numbers always. How does that help us, right? And then we have data quality. Now we're starting to get higher up on the governance scale here. So when you have good data quality, which by the way, ServiceNow Discovery obviously brings a standardized way of representing the data and the infrastructure, then that has a huge payoff in culture. And then finally, we have data context. So that is different from data ownership, because that is who owns what, but data context is basically how is it used. And for those of you who are a bit well-versed within ITOM, you might now think, but hey, Alex, isn't that service mapping? And that's not necessarily what I mean. Data context can also be discovery, for example, bringing in tags. You know, if you do cloud discovery, you get a lot of tags. And based on these tags, you know, okay, is this used for a development environment? Is it used for a production environment? What application is it used for? Whatever it is. And it could also be other type of data context, like relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And this data context in combination with data ownership is often used then for internal billing, for example. So I hope that makes sense. And I hope you can agree upon that even though you get these things, it's difficult to directly measure ROI. Obviously, it has a value and you know that. But in straight numbers, it's a difficult nut to crack. Now, here, pays off in numbers. What do we have there then? Consolidation, absolutely a huge thing. Very easy to measure in numbers. If you can kill off a few tools, then obviously that is very, very tangible, right? And then finally, here we have process improvements. These 5 factors, whenever you ask yourself about value of discovery, whatever that might be, whatever use case you have, they will fall in one of these 5 factors or 5 areas. So process improvements, consolidation, data ownership, quality, or context. I promise you, you will have a difficult time finding another exception. And if we're looking here on process improvements, it has a huge value in culture, so indirect cost reductions, and it also is very easy to measure in terms of ROI. So use this value matrix. That is what I do all the time, and it tends to work out really well for me, at least. Now, let's speak a little bit more tangible about what does this value matrix mean? What could be some examples when we speak about these different areas then? So direct cost reductions. Here we have then the two areas, consolidation and process improvements, all right? And on consolidation, like I mentioned before, if you phase out existing tools, for example, then obviously that is very easy to measure in numbers. If you can kill off, especially if you're a large organization, if you can kill off the contracts for a few other tools and replace it with one unified tool, then yes, that is absolutely a huge benefit. And it could also be phase out tools in terms of relying on Excel. And that brings me to the second point. A huge part of organizations today still rely on Excel. And it might sound silly, but it's true. And if you can reduce that manual maintenance of CIs, manual maintenance of data, etc., obviously it has a huge impact on the P&L and bottom line, because people are essentially spending that time in a way more productive way, hopefully driving up the profits and efficiency. And then something else, which is more recent, is cut out integrations. So actually, let's say 8 years ago or 5 years ago when I worked with Discovery, I would say that 80 to 90% of Discovery was the traditional protocols, all right? So what I mean with that is like SSH, SNMP, these type of things, the traditional Discovery. However, these days with cloud, with Kubernetes, Docker, etc., Discovery includes a lot of API-based discovery. So in practice, what this means is that if you invest in Discovery, you can hopefully cut out a few integrations that you otherwise would need to rely on. And this is especially true, in my experience, if you today or have plans to, let's say, create your own integration somewhere, so custom-made integrations over REST. My experience tells me that when you have more than 3 data sources over REST, that tends to be more expensive to maintain over time than Discovery. This is though true for mid-sized companies, keep that in mind. So I'm not speaking here like a CSV import or something like that, but if you go down the rabbit hole and create your own integrations, trust me, it's an expensive story. And you might now be thinking, well, isn't there this new thing called Service Graph, where there is plug and play integrations from different vendors directly to the ServiceNow CMDB? That is true, but keep in mind, you have to pay the Discovery licenses for that. So you might as well just go for Discovery then. All right, process improvements then. We have the usual suspects here, MTTR, root cause analysis, faster onboarding time. If you don't have 5, 6 different tools, but you have one tool to look in, it goes way faster to onboard people. But then we have the single pane of glass as well. This is a huge value benefit, that instead of having this spread out tools, you essentially just look at everything through a single pane of glass. And I bet you've heard that story before. I mean, that's one of the main philosophies of ServiceNow ITOM. But we have something else, and this is what I call smash the stack. And I'm going to speak about that more in a little while, but it's basically, when you try to find a needle in a haystack of an issue, that is what I call smash the stack. And it comes from NetSec or network security. And yeah, I'm going to speak about that in a little bit. So those were the direct cost reductions, but then we come to those indirect cost reductions then. So how do you quantify culture in IT? That is more difficult. This is typically where we speak about things like IT workforce perception, like if you have a good discovery tool, people can rely on the data, things are up to date, they don't feel frustrated, etc. then yeah, obviously the perception is way improved. The company reputation, I see a lot of different companies who employ people straight out of university, and these university students, or whatever you want to call them, they are used to using very modern things in their daily life, and then they start at some company and things are ancient, and that's simply not good for the reputation. So it has a huge benefit there. And then finally, conformity. When things are done the same way across geographical differences, across different teams, etc., you get a degree of conformity. And that sounds a little bit dystopian maybe, but that's actually a good thing. Standardization and consolidation, also in culture, how you work with things, because that allows for interoperability between teams. So if you don't have too many different tools, it's easier to just work together pretty much. And I just want to mention here that I'm not going to speak about how you measure these things, because that's an entirely different beast to tackle. There is this one thing called Happy Signals, which do this. They measure a lot of like employee happiness, etc. I'm, by the way, not affiliated with them at all. Neither is Einar Partners. I just know that it's a decent product, so you might want to check that out. All right, so that was so far about the values then. Now we're gonna come into the measurements, all right? And this is where it gets a little bit, let's say, trickier, because how do you measure these values? And I think this is the area where a lot of people struggle, essentially. And what I want to start off to speak about is the discovery project. So when we are looking at a discovery project, there are two main components if we're looking at the financial side of it. So we have the implementation phase, and then we have the continuous adaptation. So meaning when you're actually using the product then. During the implementation phase, that is typically where we see the capital expenditure or the investment into discovery then. And this phase, and I will speak more about this later, it usually takes something like 3 to 6 months. And a lot of people here think that in order to save money and get good ROI, we need to go for the absolute cheapest implementation, save money on consultants, etc. But that is actually not true in my experience. During the implementation stage, consultants is not the expensive part. In matter of fact, a discovery project, even the larger sizes, they, from an effort perspective, from a consultancy perspective, they're quite low comparing to other products. But the huge thing which eats the cost in the implementation phase is the internal time spent. And a lot of people don't think about this. And that is what you want to optimize within your organization. How do you spend that internal time for discovery? Continuous adaptation then. So that is where you slowly start adapting ServiceNow Discovery. And that is obviously where you have most of the OPEX or operational expenditure, mostly in terms of licensing cost here. But there could also be some other OPEX, like, for example, having a discovery admin that you have employed, or people maintaining the tool, upgrades, etc. But that's fairly neglectable in my experience. 80% of the OPEX for discovery, if not more, comes from the licensing. But this is also the part where the cost reductions actually can take place during this phase. And this has a direct correlation to how you actually use the data of discovery. And this sounds silly, but trust me, I have seen many organizations who buy discovery, but in the end of the day, they don't use the data. Because discovery by itself doesn't do anything. It's how you leverage that data. It's how you leverage that tool or process that will dictate how much money or cost reductions you can realize. And I've also seen many examples of organizations who buy, let's say, licenses, but they wait 3 years before using it. And I get that. Sometimes you might get a sweet deal, and you might just throw on, a couple of licenses here and there. But that is obviously something which tends to eat the OPEX, and it makes cost reductions more difficult. And when we speak about the implementation, here's a philosophy of mine, which is that preparation is an art form. So during the implementation stage of discovery, there are quite some people who think that, oh, we should just get started. Let's try it out. Let's gradually roll it out and see what happens. And there's no real structure around it. And I often see this. And I am the absolute opposite here. As a matter of fact, I've had situations where customers were almost like, we don't want Alex anymore because we don't see anything. He's only talking. And maybe, that's feedback to myself. But the reason for this is simply because preparation is key. And this is a good example here that I like to use as a comparison. There was in Japan, 1,200 engineers who essentially switched, as you can see in here, the article, they switched a track in a subway station in 3 hours, all right? 1,200 people, 3 hours, they switched an entire track in a subway. How did they do this? Well, they prepared for 2 years. It was a carefully orchestrated project and they succeeded. And I am of the same philosophy in discovery. So really do the preparation phase well, because then I have seen successful discoveries being rolled out in a week or less. And I'm speaking here global, large organizations, all right? So preparation is really, really important. Which brings me to the next topic here. When we're looking at a cost-efficient discovery implementation, what are some of the important attributes and elements there? There are 3 main pillars, in my opinion. Not only in my opinion, based on what I've seen before. The first one, security. If you have followed me before, you know I have spoken a lot about security. But trust me when I say that the security aspect of ServiceNow Discovery implementation is huge, and it tends to create a lot of discussions, and addressing the security is super important. Coordination. Discovery is one of those things where there's a project and you are essentially speaking to the entire IT organization, from infrastructure to database to network teams to cloud teams to DevOps teams. Literally, you're speaking to the entire IT organization because you're trying to fetch all the data, right? So if you don't know how to coordinate that well, it's going to add a huge amount to the internal time spent. And then, more importantly, political buy-in. And I'm not necessarily referring here to the political buy-in from the executive management team or something like that. But as you do the coordination, as you start speaking to different teams, you will also notice there is resistance to discovery because people have their own tools. They might feel threatened by this new fancy tool. There might be a guy who has maintained an Excel list for 10 years and it's his little baby. Whatever it is, you will find resistance during the project. So to have a methodology for addressing that resistance and really ensuring that political buy-in within the organization, that will also ensure adaptation later on, meaning that people actually use the product. And I should mention here that the cost reduction potential, it scales fairly linear to the IT organization's size. So if you're a huge IT organization, there is a huge potential for cost reduction through discovery, but also be aware of that there is a risk profile, and the risk also increases the larger the organization is for the reasons I'm mentioning here in front of you. And interestingly enough here, as you can see, this has nothing to do with technical aspects almost. It's all the human side and the human element of rolling out discovery. And that's where typically the majority of the risks are. And I should just mention here that we are now going to have, the first time ever, by the way, a bootcamp for how to roll out discovery successfully. This is a little bit, let's say, shameless self-advertisement, so to speak. But this is a bootcamp for 3 days. It's going to be in October. And you can find it if you go to einar.partners/bootcamp. And we will essentially, or I personally will teach for 3 days, approximately 15 hours, how you can succeed with rolling out Discovery. So if you're curious about knowing more about the implementation side of things, then you might want to consider this one, or for your team or whatever it might be. All right, continuing. One other important aspect is that people tend to lack data when they base their decisions. So whenever it starts with a discovery project, how do you actually know if it's going to be successful, and how do you know if it has been successful? So there's a difference there. So do you do the discovery project because you are sure of its success? And then when you have done the project, can you verify that it has been successful in terms of cost reductions and so forth? That's why it's really important to measure KPIs before you start the discovery project. So you have something tangible to show that, like, okay, this actually paid off in these and these areas. And remember the value matrix I showed before. You can then measure things in different processes. You can measure things in consolidation, measure things in culture, like employee happiness, whatever it is. So measuring is super important. And I'm going to give you an example right now, a study case of how we in the past measured this. And hopefully this can serve as a little bit of inspiration for you guys if you are curious on taking benchmarks then. So what we did was that we tried to quantify toil, and you might wonder, what is toil? It's basically repetitive, boring work that engineers are doing every day that makes them hate their job. So decreasing employee frustration, meanwhile reducing costs. That's a sweet sentence for sure. But the driver here then, as I mentioned, is that for this customer that we were working with, they essentially saw a burnout of engineers because they had to do so many dead tasks every day. To set the stage here, this was a global IT organization. They had approximately 120 IT ops staff, which sounds a lot, but what I mean with that is they had 120 people on a daily basis who in one way or another were working with infrastructure. So it could be the network team, it could be the database team, it could be the help desk, you name it, right? Site reliability engineers, etc. So these engineers or IT ops, they spent an insane amount of time on digging for data related to basic infrastructure information. And you might not think so, but if you start measuring how much time, if you don't have a CMDB and you don't have Discovery, and you start measuring how much time people actually spend on just trying to find information, it is staggering. Like, imagine how many emails you go through just to find some old information about a server, for example, or maybe if you have 5 different tools, you log into 5 different tools on a daily basis, or whatever it might be. When you don't have a CMDB and Discovery, then finding that information is very, very cumbersome and time consuming. And this is what I called before smash the stack then. So what we did here was that we focused in a pilot group before the, let's say, before the Discovery rollout was going to take place, because we wanted to have good data for basing our decision, should we continue with Discovery on a more global scale. So what we did was we actually went down, or I went down and did real interviews with people. I sat next to them and asked them, show me your daily work. How do you work? And I started just looking through the process and how they were working with the IT infrastructure. We started doing benchmarks and tracking. And we also looked at current statistics. So for example, how long time did it take to resolve an incident? Because if it takes very long time to resolve an incident and you spend a lot of time digging for data, it's probably an indicator that you can optimize it somewhere. So what were the results then? Well, in average, all of these engineers or IT ops, they spent approximately half an hour per day just digging for, basic infrastructure related data. This might sound like a lot. It's not. because if you're working with IT, especially in infrastructure, your main job is literally to sit and go to different servers, check history, check whatever it is, right? So 33 minutes per day in average based on this pilot group, right? And what we find out after testing then Discovery and doing the same benchmarks is that we reduced it down to 14 minutes. So approximately by half. And yet again, it might not sound like a lot, like, yeah, we save 15 minutes per engineer per day. Is that really a lot? Well, trust me, it adds up. So we did a project, we did a measurement afterward, and we looked at what did it actually save then. So 19 minutes per FTE and day, all right? That translates to 73 hours per FTE and year. Globally, for this organization, that was 8,760 hours across the IT organization. In days, that is 1,090 days saved, let's say, per year, which translated to roughly 4 full FTEs then. And, that, at least if we're looking at the European standard and prices of how much an engineer costs or an IT operations, then that is roughly 240,000 euros per year then, which they unlocked in more productive time. But there is a truth with modification here, because when we started with Discovery, actually we needed a full-time resource to maintain Discovery. So part of the cost savings went to paying for that resource. But nonetheless, what I want to illustrate here is, yet again, not to inflate numbers in your face or something like that, but it's rather to show you that this was from one simple use case, and this is what it was saved then. And if you do this for different use cases beforehand, then you really start basing things on data. And that is super important to do, because otherwise it would be very difficult to determine the success. I hope that makes sense. So what I want to do now is to speak a little bit about the benchmarks then. So these are based on approximately 30 implementations. And we have now roughly 15 minutes left. So if you have any questions, now would be a good time to ask those questions, because hopefully I will have maybe 5 or 10 minutes where I can address the questions. And if there are not any questions, well, then we'll end a little bit earlier. So, all right, implementation benchmarks then. So this is for ServiceNow Discovery. And this right here is the size versus duration. And what do I mean with size then? So the size here refers to a combination of factors. So more specifically, node count. And what I mean with that is the amount of infrastructure in scope for the Discovery project. We also have the IT organization size. So how many employees are there in the IT organization? Is it a global one? Is it geographically spread out, etc.? We have the network size. So how large are the networks, the subnets? And then we also have here operations partners. And what I mean with that is outsourced. Because it's very common, of course, that if you are a company who outsource a lot of your IT infrastructure, you might be wondering, is there really any value for us to utilizing Discovery? But that's more than on the cultural aspect, for example, data ownership, data governance, you are the owner of your data. So we wanted to include also organizations here who really had a lot of outsourced IT then. So on the bottom side, we have duration, and then we have the size then, all right? And by the way, this is based on implementations that we've done. So here we have a timeline of 3 to 12 months. And here we have the size from small to significant to massive. And you might be wondering what dictates what here. The scope here, we have different colors. We have below 5,000 IPs. So when I'm speaking below 5,000 IPs, I mean reachable IPs here, not the size of the subnets, but IPs that respond and that you want to include in the CMDB and Discovery. Then we have over 10,000 IPs and over 25,000 IPs. So these are the different colors, all right? And here is some of these benchmarks. Now there's a lot on the screen and you might be looking everywhere right now. Keep in mind, this will be shared later, so you will get access to these benchmarks so you can investigate them yourself. But I would like to remove a few of these benchmarks to make a few observations. So here, let's look at 4 data points to start with. What is interesting here for me to see is, for example, these 2 data points. So here we have something of a very similar size, but it takes double the amount of time. And then in my experience, the primary reason for this, yet again, was coordination. All right. So we're seeing here that if the coordination is poor during a discovery project, if the feedback loops are long, and what I mean with long feedback loops is that if it takes you a long time to get firewall opens, if there is very in-depth, in detail security discussions or clearance or whatever it might be, that tends to add a lot to the timeline then. And the same here is very interesting for me, that we see a correlation here that a project which was rather massive in size, so over 25,000 reachable IPs then, took almost the same amount of time. And I remember these 2 projects, and they took almost exactly the same amount of time, like I'm speaking down to the day here almost. And what does this tell me, and why am I mentioning these data points then? Well, the reason I'm saying this is because this is a clear indication that it's not the size of the infrastructure necessarily that dictates how long time the discovery project is going to take. In matter of fact, it's a neglectable part, but it really is about those other factors that I mentioned before. So as I said, I have seen discovery being rolled out, building the CMDBs of tens and thousands of CIs in the span of a few days, if the preparation is done right. I should mention, of course, there might be some bias here in this data because, and I want to acknowledge that we are looking for certain type of responses just because we are humans. So the way we ask questions might add to a little bit of bias to the data. But nonetheless, I think the data adds a lot of value to put things in perspective, that when it comes to the timelines, it's not the size of the network, etc., but there are other factors that are in play then. I'm now going to look at another type of benchmarks, which is then related to the primary challenges. So we reached out to 12 organizations that we, in one capacity or another, have worked with Discovery with, and they had Discovery running, it was optimized, etc. And then we asked them questions. What were the primary challenges during the implementation phase of Discovery? And we had 4 categories. We had security, we had coordination, we had technical, and then we had other, so things that couldn't be captured in these 3 categories then. And the selection you see here is the first choice, which is the very dark purple color, the second choice, which is the slightly less purple, and then finally the third almost pink one. There is a margin of error of approximately 5% here, by the way, so keep that in mind. Nonetheless, we can clearly see here that based on these 12 rollouts, the majority, if we spoke about the primary challenge that they had, was related to security. So yet again, this for me illustrates and confirms what I have seen based on my experience, that security is still a huge factor to consider when it comes to ServiceNow Discovery then. The other part was indeed related to coordination. Same there. A lot of people use that as a first choice, then the second choice, and also you see here, very few people had that as the third choice. And then finally, the technical aspects. I think it was only one who had the technical aspects as a first choice of their primary challenges. And then there was a few, I think 1 or 2, who had it as a second choice. But nonetheless, you see here that when we speak about ServiceNow Discovery, it is not so much the technical factors which is the difficulty, but it is rather the other constraints. And then for the others, yeah, as I mentioned, it's something which didn't fall under these categories here then. So these were two benchmarks that we have gathered for this, specifically for this webinar only. If you are curious about more benchmarks or have more questions around these type of data and timelines, you can always reach out to me. And also you can find contact information to us on Einar Partners website. All right. To finalize this webinar, as we only have approximately 8 minutes left here, there are some key points that I would like to summarize and for people to consider when it comes to cost optimization and ROI. The first one, as I mentioned in the beginning, categorize the, let's say, value drivers in culture versus numbers, because that way you really know what to expect and what to look for, especially if you're going to explain that to management and so forth. Number two, define and prioritize where the primary benefit are to set those expectations. So are we doing discovery? If we're looking, if you remember this maturity scale of IT organizations, if you are very far on that maturity scale, then you for sure have different motivations than if you are at the very beginning, for example. So define and prioritize these primary benefits, and that will dictate how you measure then the ROI then. Realize that most CapEx is consumed by internal time, not consultants necessarily. Yet again, I'm emphasizing it. Coordination here reduces the CapEx. Successful cost reduction. So once you start using discovery, it has a direct correlation then to the usage of data. So how do you use that discovery data? How much can you consolidate? And what is the actual adoption rate of discovery? So don't buy discovery and never use it is pretty much what I'm saying. It sounds obvious, but trust me. As I mentioned also, 80%, more than 80% of any OPEX comes from the discovery licensing cost pretty much. A difficult political landscape with long feedback loops, it entails a higher risk. Keep in mind, there's also a higher reward there if you succeed, because most likely if you have a difficult political landscape and there are long feedback loops, you don't have very intuitive tools within your organization because it has never been allowed to grow. So maybe this would be an opportunity to take a jab at it. Scope and network size. So scope of the network size, amount of infra, etc. That is actually a neglectable variable when it comes to how long time it takes to roll out discovery, but it is rather the other factors. And then last but not least here, point number 8, remember to measure data points before versus after rollout. And trust me, don't ignore this one. Spend a few days to really do those investigations, because then you base things way more on data essentially. So with that being said, this was what I had in terms of the webinar. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to stop the screen sharing and see if I've received any questions here. So I got a good question here directly. Based on your experience, what do you think are the specific security or technical drawbacks of ServiceNow Discovery when compared with other discovery products? Well, my answer to that question is that it used to be the fact that you needed the credentials stored in ServiceNow, which always were a reason of concern. You also needed local admin. That is no longer the case. There is now agent-based discovery. And more importantly, you also have stuff such as just enough administration, privileged access management, etc. So right now, when we're speaking about the product year 2021, I don't think there are any that large specific security constraints or technical drawbacks as such. They have caught up pretty good in my opinion. I've also received a question here from Ted, who is asking, in your experience, Alexander, where are most companies in their development from legacy to cutting edge when looking at discovery? In my experience, most people who look at discovery are either one or the other. They are either quite far back, so they don't have a CMDB at all pretty much, or they're very further down the line and they're very modern with DevOps and so forth. It's rare that I see the middle. It exists, but it tends to be rather polarized there in my experience. All right, guys, I see there is more questions, but I don't think I have time to answer those because they are quite in-depth and complex. So I will get back specifically to you guys about those questions. For the rest of you who have been here on the webinar here today, I'd like to sincerely thank you for your time. It's a great pleasure to see so many people interested, and I hope that you keep up to date. Please subscribe to the Einar Partners LinkedIn page, where I will share and we will share a lot of ITOM related content. Trust me, it's never going to be sales things, but just pure good content, similar to the benchmarks and so forth. Have a great day. And if you are curious about discovery, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Alexander@einar.partners. And if you're a consultant curious about really mastering that, that discovery rollout and how you do this from a practical perspective, don't forget about the bootcamp coming up. It's the first time ever by Einar Partners, and it will be me personally who teaches for 3 days. So it's going to be super fun, and I'm looking forward to that. And if you use the code webinar when you sign up for the bootcamp, I will give you 20% off. So have a good day, everyone, and then see you around in the ITOM space.